we're trying to look at how do we affect where we draw the line and call something an RFI versus a conversation with somebody, right? There's different boundaries that we cross. There's a boundary, the boundary of realization really is where we spent the most time, but there's also what we have in our documentation with the CDX is the boundary of alignment. So between planning and design, there's probably more where you're having iterative discussions. It's cyclical in nature, and folks are trying to get to a point, and there's not as much of a requirement to necessarily legally document it. The key thing that came out of our discussion is talk about it, get it out up front, and let's define that so that way we know where these things are falling and define the process on how you're going to use that information and talk about it. So I want to welcome everybody here this afternoon. As we know, this is our digital twin breakout room. Our conversation, our topic of conversation today is the boundary of realization. With us today is Randy Paulson from Duke Energy.
I'm Randy Paulson, like you said, with Duke Energy, and so I'm responsible for engineering and construction for our major projects. And so we've got several initiatives going on associated with improving the process and transforming the company. And one of them is improving the whole information management process. And as you can imagine, we interact with a lot of contractors, a lot of different ones. And historically, we've just kind of forced them to do it our way. And so it's difficult for them. And sometimes they do have to do things twice to satisfy us. But the other part of it is sometimes it slows the information down and we may miss something. And so we're trying to, resolve several of these with just a better workflow process.
Good. Thanks, Randy. Tammy?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm Tammy Alexander. Prior to joining Rivet 4 years ago, I spent a lot of my life with Skanska USA as a job site accountant. Built 10 out of the ground projects for them and spent many years in a job site trailer. I was an accountant and my husband was project manager. So pretty much had to learn it all from the ground up. We joined Skanska right out of college and spent a lot of time on the ground building big projects and learned a lot from each and every single one of them. And Rivet is really the goal of what we do is to move data, right? We want each individual user in the space, in the construction technology space, to be able to stay in their own application. Because if you don't, you're going to have people using Teams and Zoom on the same project, and it's going to create issues, right? So let them use their own projects, let them use their own applications, but let's move data and share data between those two systems or multiple systems. We have some successful integrations among outside organizations, not just data inside one organization, but data moving between two organizations using two totally different projects. So let's move that to the third, the third organization or the fourth organization. So that's why I'm here and excited to continue this conversation forward. It's we got a long way to go in the industry, but man, we're pushing forward as we do it. So.
All right. Thank you, Tammy. My name is Kelly Doyle. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for ProjectReady. We are building a platform that creates an integrated data environment for the industry, being able to unify platforms like BIM 360 and SharePoint and Teams and PlanGrid and Procore. I think I mentioned them already. So we got just bringing all together the multiple platforms that we have going on. My background before that was in construction technology consulting. So that's why Nathan grabbed me to moderate this topic, because there's lots of good ideas from lots of great personalities here, and trying to take this and lead it from a consulting perspective is what he's asked me to do. So that's what we're going to try to do today is look at the process that we used in a previous previous session, last time, we started looking at RFIs with Duke, and that's what Randy was bringing up. How do we add some process here? How do we look at how we map these things together so that Randy and his organization can look at those workflows, look at those integration points and say, gosh, there's so much going on here with multiple organizations. How do we start doing that? So I'm going to pull up the screen again and bring up a slide that will guide us in this first piece. Let's make sure we're all on the same page here. We're talking the same language. So Randy, I wonder if you could give folks the perspective of the owner here when we're talking about RFIs and where they fall in these different phases, or before or after the boundary alignment or boundary realization. Just give us some thoughts on how you guys look at RFIs as an example.
Yeah, sure, Kelly. And so from Duke's perspective, and so there's, let's plan, design, build, operate, and we'll kind of go into, I'm going to talk more about design and build. And so we execute projects a couple different ways. One is EPC, where we hire a single contractor that has design and build and some parts of commissioning in their scope. And so they're more integrated between them. And then we have others to where we might hire an engineer separately and hire a contractor, multiple contractors separately. And we kind of insert ourselves right smack in the middle. And we also insert ourselves right smack in the middle with the EPCs also, because we want to know what's going on and we want to know that our design criteria that we set up at the beginning is being met. And so for us, during the design phase, we don't have RFIs. That's part of a review process. And so we're reviewing drawings, specifications, documents that are produced by the engineer, and they're running them by us, and we're reviewing them and sending them back, and with an eye on sticking with the standard and maybe some things we forgot to tell them in the design criteria perhaps. But primarily it's meeting the design criteria and the intent of what we wanted. And so we get through that process. And another reason that we don't implement the RFI in that process is because we want to, that's basically a back and forth conversation between us and the designer. And we haven't spent a lot of money yet. And sometimes if we add equipment or if we change a design or something or other, obviously that'll turn into costs later, but the costs are pretty low if we do it during the design phase. And so we really try to do our best job of spending it right there. And so once we get to boundary of realization, and so I consider that IFC when the drawings are thrown over from the engineer to the construction, and it's maybe a gray zone because contractor is involved in the design process to kind of influence the design to make it constructible. Lay that aside for a minute. Once the IFC drawing goes over the boundary, so to speak, then it's now the RFI process kicks in. And so because now we want to know anything about what's going on between the contractor and engineer. We want to know if there's any deviation, if there's a miss, if there's somebody just doesn't know what's going on, all that kind of thing. And so there could be hundreds or maybe more requests for information during that phase of the work throughout the construction, and maybe a little bit into commissioning as well. And we want to be right smack in the middle of that, especially if the engineer is a third party. And, the engineer is making a decision that could very well cost us money with change orders later. So we want to, we may insert ourselves in that process. And even though we have to respect the engineer as the engineer of record and the technical authority, but at the same time, there's multiple ways to skin a cat. So we want to make sure we're skinning it in a way that meets our objective. And so hopefully that kind of gets us kicked off there, Kelly. And so for us, we're thinking about information management, question management during the build phase.
Very good. Tammy, I thought maybe you could bring in some perspective from your time sitting in the contractor chair, and then temper that with your time now as a technology provider. Are these phases and boundaries, do they still align? Or are you seeing different perspectives? What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that what's really, really interesting to me, especially as, and Randy and I have chatted once before about this, but I feel like on every single project that I was on, and they were all mostly in the retail and pharmaceutical space, built pharmaceutical facilities for Wyeth several times down in Puerto Rico and malls all over the U.S. But the boundary of realization for each project, each full project was different. And that was based on who you were working with. Were they folks that you have worked with before? Did they have the same engagement roles? Were they involved from the beginning? Was it a repeat customer where we'd done this 4 or 5 times? Was it a brand new customer? So the boundary of realization, depending on the project, depending on your relationship with the entities that you're working with, depending on who's involved from the start to the finish, can change. And I really feel like we all have to be aware of that, and we all have to take each project kind of, and massage it. And Randy talks about it from the owner's perspective. My husband's now on the development side. On the owner side, and it's very different from their perspective. They're looking at an entirely different workflow. They are literally involved from the day an idea is formed to releasing it, turning the lights on, and maybe turning it over to the space, right? Turning the space over. So it is. I think we all have to be willing to adjust this boundary of realization based on the project. That's kind of the and we're seeing that from an integration perspective as well. What contractors want to do. Our new format of Procore integration specifically is geared towards architects, engineers, and then GCs, construction management firms using Procore and moving data and answering it in your own system and moving and answering that information back and forth. There's oftentimes more parties than that. And that's what we're realizing. There are more parties involved. There are more solutions involved. So what's next for that space?
That's a great point. We kept focusing in on this boundary of realization, so I thought it would be a good time to bring in this slide, which is graphically and also by definition kind of defining, how do we pick that point? Based upon your perspectives, I mean, you just alluded to it. There's a line moving at different, from project to project. The way the International Group for Lean Construction, it was the one that put out this diagram. The way they describe the boundary of realization is the point at which quantity and rate of resource consumption accelerates by the greatest margin. Randy, I know you picked a line in the sand in your previous comments in the last slide, but can you give us an understanding with those different types of contracts that you have, how that point of that resource acceleration changes or is different in those different kinds of projects?
Yeah, well, once it goes to construction, that's where the money, happens. And so, you're talking a large quantity of resources. You're talking productivity. You're talking, interfaces between just trades, even if it's the same contract. And so interferences become very expensive and that kind of thing. And so, like I said, I feel like you can, if you really just knock yourself out during that design phase and just worry yourself to death to get rid of those things, then construction has a chance to be successful. And in my mind, the owner's role is to make the contractor successful. And so we want to, we need to hit, what the objective of the project. And so we got to hold feet to the fire, but we want to make them successful. And the definition you just kind of shared about once the, resources ramp up and that kind of thing, well, materials start arriving on site and you start getting many, many crews of welders. We had a 3-on-1 combined cycle with almost 1,500 craft on it. And, you're trying to keep up with what 1,500 men and women are doing day to day and feeding them to where that crew has a chance to be productive. And so that they're not walking back and forth to
That's right.
The materials yard to get something that they didn't have, and or they have no idea it's not, they're totally shocked when they get to the work site because it's not at all what they thought it was going to be. And trying to work through those kind of things. That's when, just kind of get out your checkbook because you're going to be peeling off some dollars. And so is to try to reduce that.
So in our pre-call, right, Randy, you described for an EPC type of contract, you're being very specific about the type of equipment that is going in there. Right?
Oh yeah.
Whereas for a traditional AEC project, people may be making decisions on components later down the path from a healthcare perspective or a retail perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Tammy, maybe you can talk about some of those variables from a traditional AEC project that pushes that boundary around. And we're going to be talking in the next slide or two about good RFIs and bad RFIs, and understand that impact or explain that impact if you could.
Well, from my perspective, and so I didn't share when I gave my introduction, but I've spent 12 years here at Duke as an owner. The 30 years before that was as a contractor. And so in my whole career, I've always worked in this utility, large industrial scale business, except for 1 year. It was 365 days. For a small architectural engineering company that did water, wastewater, and architectural work. And I'll tell you what, it absolutely drove me crazy. And because they did it differently, and like what Tammy had alluded to, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but what the engineer, in my mind, really doesn't, quote, design. They don't really engineer the system, process, building, whatever it is. They kind of put together enough information of where they can award it to a contractor. The major equipment, HVAC, which is not combustion turbines and the things like that. It's HVAC systems and the electrical. None of that is really, truly, none of it's purchased. You hand it to the contractor and the contractor buys everything. And so you really don't know what you're getting until the contractor's on board and then they buy it. Well, the engineering's been done. So now the contractor's responsible for connecting the dots and putting all that together, and it can turn into a bag of worms pretty quickly. Whereas the way the heavy industry does it is we buy everything. I mean, everything, other than things like, wire and pipes and light fixtures and, stuff. We don't buy that kind of stuff, but instruments, motors, everything else, air compressors, we buy it all. And so when we have the design does the engineering, they know exactly where the nozzle is on that compressor station, where the outlet is. And when we design the pipe, it's going right to where that nozzle is because we know how high it's sitting on the pad and we know where it's going to be. And so that stuff is designed to the nines. And so it's just a different way of doing it. And so this whole BIM 3D modeling and fabricating stuff in shop and bringing it to the field. That's how we do it in the utility industry.
Interesting. So Tammy, what I'd like to get your perspective here is if we look at the graph, right, we see an inverse relationship between the ability to impact cost and performance and that cost going through the roof, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. In the job trailer and in the accounting side of it. Just explain some of those variables and where those design changes made an impact on the projects you were working on.
Yeah, we talk about this so much in conversations that we've had every day, right? So at Skanska specifically, and still with customers that I work with every single day at Rivet, we talk about the cost of a change, the simple costs of a change or the impact of a change that happens. So as we have these design meetings and we're going through design, the specification documents are issued, and then we would go buy them, right? We go buy, and let's just say that we can't get, and especially in today's world, right? I mean, how much has lumber skyrocketed? I mean, the cost of lumber and the cost of steel is incredible. With what COVID has done to us, and simply getting some supplies is crazy, right? And that has impacted the cost. So a job we were awarded last year and now we're purchasing is totally different. the budget can be totally different. Not only that, we might not be able to get something that was spec. So now we have to go redesign. We've got to ask RFIs to go find out, is this alternative, going to be good enough for the engineer? So we're asking all of these questions and we're having all of these impacts. And that's not thought about in the, in the purchase, in the design, in this design phase, and then it's turned over to the contractor and then we go build it, right? And every single RFI leads to not just one change. You guys all know that, right? It's going to impact and have this waterfall cascading effect. There's going to be one thing that happens because we can't get trained to supply that. Now we've got to go to, this person because they've got a backlog for 2 years or whatever that may be, right? It's impactful based on not just one thing that the RFI is encapsulating, but then it leads to another one, into another one, into another one. So all of these changes, the longer we extend the process of design, and the more we can spend time with the contractor, being involved in the design process, being at the table, as I like to say, literally at the table and helping and assisting. And sometimes we don't have that ability, right? Sometimes we just don't. But the more that we have them at the table, the better chance we have of reducing that bad RFIs on the other side, right? Because they're going to have a better idea of the environment. I mean, they're more aware of the environment and the cost impact of certain things. They've seen it, they've done it. Their estimators are out there and reviewing. So I don't know if that provides any insight, but we see it every day that it just is leading to more and more questions as architects, engineers, and this all being turned over to be purchased later on. It's just leading to a lot more red for everybody's budget.
Sure. So the next thing I want to ask in relation to this slide that we're looking at is quantifying good RFIs and bad RFIs and determining that impact. Randy, do you guys have any measures in place to quantify them and measure impact?
We don't do that very well, Kelly, but we do have a few RFI criteria, if you will, that we try to keep up with. And I'll tell you a few of them that we definitely don't keep up with. One is how many. At least obviously we keep up with that because we keep record them all, but we don't try to control the number of RFIs because if we do that, then the fear is somebody will stop writing them because they get the impression that we're beating them up because they're writing too many RFI. I want the RFI. If there's a question, I want to hear it, and then we'll deal with it. But and then the other one we bend over backwards to not quantify is design error.
Yeah.
And once again, the designer becomes very concerned that they're making errors, and maybe there's a legal issue or something like that. And so next thing you know, oh, none of them are design errors. It's, oh, this happened and that happened. Well, now you've got energy being spent to spin RFIs, and that's counterproductive. I don't want that either. And so what we try to keep up with things like, is it a clarity question that, it's just not clear on what in the world do you mean by this? That's just a clarity RFI. Is there a cost? Like, is there a change order that results from it? We want to know that. Is there a, what was the other one? Or unforeseen condition, somebody dug something up or they expected something to be somewhere and it just wasn't there. And, those kind of things that are, truly out of somebody's control. And so we try to kind of categorize those kind of things. But then the other metric that we really try to keep up with is, when was the RFI written? How many are left open, and when was it closed? Because what we want to do is be known as we're answering and closing RFIs, swiftly.
There's a difference between process and workflow, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way to modify one or the other to achieve change? Has anybody seen any upside there, any benefit that they can share with the group?
Hi, Kelly. I actually had a question before we could open up the comments.
Yeah.
Is there a way we could learn from these RFIs from project to project? Do we collect these and their reasons why they're raised? Do they cost money, not cost money? Classify them in various forms? If we're truly using data, from various systems in an integrated fashion, I would assume longitudinally, project to project, you should be able to gain some wisdom and utilize that. Any comments from either one of our speakers?
Yeah, I would,
Go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Tammy.
Randy. I was
No,
just gonna say that,
please.
that we, you know, we at Skanska actually would have, after every single project, we did a lessons learned. And we got every member of the team, owner, architect, builder together, and we sat down and we reviewed every single RFI, if it was hundreds of them, and there were several projects that had hundreds and hundreds of RFIs, to determine the impact. And if it was a repeat customer, we knew we were going to do this over again, right? How do we avoid this next time? How do we avoid this? What was the impact and how do we avoid it? Those were really the two questions that we looked at every single time we did a project where, you know, if there were one or two RFIs, great. We did a great job, but we know that's not the case. How do we avoid these in the future? And I think that's what we all wanted to get to, was how do we use the data we have? We've already gone through this essentially learning phase. How do we learn from what we've now written down on paper, let's say? So there is, I think one of the problems with the industry right now is we have so much data, we don't know what to do with it also. We're in a data-driven world, but everybody's kind of like in this shell shock of, now we have all this data. What do we do with all of this data, and how do we manage all of this data, and how many reports can we run, because we talk about running reports all the time. So I think being smart about also how we use data is another piece of this puzzle, but we got to use the data to grow from it, right?
Yeah, Tammy, congratulations on being brought up in the Skanska world. I really admire that company. No, I mean,
yeah, the great company, absolutely,
great culture.
Yeah.
After you decided that the lessons learned were captured, did you have a mechanism in place so that people would not do those same mistakes again? Like, was there any teeth, or like, well, we kind of suggest that you don't do it like this anymore, or was it like you're fired?
No, there were steps put in place to ensure, and especially for certain owners. I was very specific to a team that did work for owners, multiple times. So we did work for Wyeth, we did work for the Taubman Group. We had essentially we used to use Prolog. I think they've moved on to multiple systems now. I think they finally moved off of Prolog. Some of them are using Procore. But we did use a system where, for specific owners, we could go in and drill down into, data and remarks and things that we had learned, and we were responsible for putting that in for other project teams and for ensuring that, if we made a mistake and we didn't go look for asbestos, and we were, at a greenfield project and we were tearing down buildings, and we had a big miss in Charlotte once. What was going to happen on the next project? What we're going to do in advance, right? We're going to do an environmental study. We were going to do, so yes, those were put in place where we made recommendations to the next project teams, and that was all built in Prolog. And we had systems and documentation that we used in Prolog for that.
To build on Anil's question, which I thought was very insightful, did you tie together those lessons learned to how RFIs became change orders? And did you actually then follow that thread? Because I know I quit after about 4 months of a company in New York City, GC, very, very famous one, because they were change order contractors.
Yeah.
Where the more RFIs, the better. We
actually did that for subs, Paul, specifically, and they were blacklisted. We wouldn't hire them again. And we did I will say Skanska did a really good job of ensuring that we spent time utilizing the data that we had, especially Skanska, projects that I worked on with these particular owners. We were known not to do that, right? That's why we were brought on to do the next job. And the subcontractors that we brought on had to be the same way. So we had to have a way of tracking those subs that we worked with that performed well. If we contracted out work, we needed to know that we were going to have, contracts that didn't have 150 change orders on them with, that led to those things. And we tracked that down to the nitty gritty detail. And those, essentially in our world, those subcontractors did not work with us again.
Kelly, these sub processes in the context of a digital twin have fascinating potential outcomes, especially as we start to more and more agree about this cross interdisciplinary analysis of, like in the case of where Tammy's coming from, a GC over a sub. But Randy's perspective, with the owner's hat, has got to be fascinating about being able to look backwards so that you can actually leap forward and start those simulations ahead of time through a digital twin, with the understanding that, well, this is the way that this happened in the past. So, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Right?
That's right.
Because you start to find these breadcrumbs that will start to help different owners in different ways, because their needs are so different from what our wishes are for how we want to work. So it's kind of like an awkward thing here where you're right. We have a data lake and we have this potential of a metaverse that can happen, but through what lens and through what device are we going to be looking at the matrix?
Yep.
And at that point, risk and liability come into play.
Absolutely.
Because the way that you're going about it at Skanska is an internal exercise. Once you start crossing boundaries into subcontractors or potentially upstream into the owner, what happens when something goes wrong? Do I really want to have it documented that much?
Yep. Yeah. A lot of risk and liability there. Absolutely. 100%.
Question.
Yeah.
That's actually an initiative we're working on with the AGC right now, because why should we be able to track safety, understand safety, and not have that be covered under liability?
Yeah.
And this is the same thing. Why cannot, it's a disservice not to track safety. And if we're going to be
Absolutely.
penalized to track it, then people aren't going to do it. And it's going to be the same thing, copy, paste. So we're actually working with the AGC to get some regulation on that in discovery or procedures like that it's potentially protected, because tracking that information only makes you better as an individual, and sharing that information only makes those individuals better as well.
So Dan, is that from the contractual side of things that you're going to say that you're indemnified?
Basically.
Wow. That would be something.
It's
The trade-off with the transparency, right?
Absolutely.
That's that elephant right there. So we're small nibbles right now is probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. I mean, the other one is mental health, right? I mean, people in the industry have always been scared to, it takes a back seat, and no one wants to report anyone, being unwell from a mental aspect. And it's this elephant in the room, right? But no one wants to come forward because it is a liability and it's a risk for the entire industry. And that's why the numbers are so high, right? I mean, we've all seen it, especially this past year.
Well, look at that.
That's a whole other thing.
Yeah, and look at that poor kid that was running the Moynihan terminal in New York City.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He just couldn't take it anymore.
With 38, 30,
Unbelievable.
36, 38 years old. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
Yeah.
But for the first time in my career, there's the first time that anyone's really talking about it out in the open now.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
So at
I'm
least
so
we're
happy
having a
about that.
conversation. Yeah, at least conversations happening.
Sure. Nick, it looks like you raised your hand a minute ago. What would you like to bring in?
Yep. Yeah, I just want to talk about the RFIs. We've had some success, especially in the COVID situation, of using video RFIs as a way to bridge sometimes the geographic boundary and to humanize the project, because there are so many people. So, a superintendent or whomever can be talking about it right in front of the problem, describing it and asking for help. And I think that when you ask for help personally, it goes a long way. Nobody ever turns down another person, but RFIs themselves can be flat and impersonal.
Or you wrote them and the other person interprets them an entirely different way,
Yeah,
right,
definitely.
Nick?
Oh yeah, it's the same with, like,
they get
email,
misinterpreted.
communication.
I love the video thing.
Yeah.
I mean, but I guess the question for me would be, do you have
They're backed up.
yeah, I mean, how do you get the answers, and then how do you capture that in a form that
I think you
can be
just let-
tracked, I guess.
Yeah. No, you'd have to send a confirming RFI
Yeah, okay.
along with it perhaps, but I think as a way to, just bridge that gap.
Make it
it's a good thing.
personal, make it
Yeah.
personal.
The other
Yeah.
thought that I had just listening to this group and seeing the boundary is maybe we should be calling before the boundary, it's a request for integration. Like, I want to integrate with the team and I need something, like, let's work together on it. And if we're really thinking about it after the boundary, it's really a defect. And if we really, I mean, that might be harsh. I mean, I'm a lean practitioner, so I'm like, it's a defect. But like, that's what it is. And perhaps if we called it that. And then the other thing that just as a commentary on this is that, if we have a problem, we try to solve it right in the moment and not wait till the lessons learned, because really the trail has gone cold.
Yeah.
So the learning needs to happen in the moment. So the rate at which the team can learn, it's just an opportunity for the team to learn quickly.
Yeah.
Interesting. So with the concept of this golden thread in mind, I want to come back to a comment, Randy, you made during our pre-call about historically, from your experience, the impact of needing to try to classify information in the process, and that extra effort and the impact that it had on the job, whether or not they actually ended up adding it or not. And that led to some discussions about picking a line in the sand, if you will, maybe at some trigger point. Can you talk about how the trying to add that extra classification, while it was valuable from an analytics standpoint, actually had a negative impact on the project?
Well, I think the comment you're speaking of there, Kelly, was during the design phase. And so my experience on the design phase, and I worked at Black and Beach for 20 years, and we were fairly, anal about, things. And so we got into this kick about, keeping up with changes during the design phase. And after a while, I mean, we would just be kind of looking at each other, and, we just kind of came to the realization that it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, the design phase is not this straight line like that digital thread that just runs right through design phase, and then you cross this imaginary boundary, and next thing you do is construction. The design phase is a bunch of circles, and so you kind of move and you go back, and then you kind of go further and you go back. Oh shucks, I didn't realize that I'm hitting that pipe's in the way and you can't move it, but I can move my tray. So let me go back. And so it's part of the design process. And we didn't need to wear ourselves out with keeping up with each and every one of those changes. It was the design process. We need to allow it to go and let the professionals speak. And same thing, if we brought construction in, if we had EPC, I vividly remember this guy, Wayne Davis, who was one of the toughest, meanest, and I'm not kidding, construction superintendents you've ever met, sitting in a cubicle with a structural engineer that looked a whole lot like Tammy, and they're sitting there working on how he wanted the combustion turbine foundation rebar to be laid out. And I thought, man, this is history in the making right here. And she was listening and she was working on it. He was trying to make it constructible to where it was safe and he could do it quickly and easily. And she was listening. And it was a huge success. And so there's a case. Now, we weren't writing RFIs, it wasn't that she was goofing up and screwing up, but if she had done it the way we typically do it, trying to reduce quantities and all that kind of thing, it would have made it very hard for them to construct in the field months and months later. And at that point, he's stuck. There's nothing he can do. All he can do is do what it is. You know what I'm saying? And so I kind of allow those circles to happen in the design.
Yeah. And then from that, Randy, you're going to get the RFIs and you're going to get the change impacts and you're going to get, the cost impacts later on, right? That's the bad RFI. That's the one that you don't want on the other side of the fence, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because, rebar is always interfering with the anchor bolts, and these anchor bolts are massive and they're like 3-4 feet long, and you gotta, nobody ever designs the rebar good enough to where you miss all that stuff. And it's just a fist fight when they're building it. And Wayne was trying to reduce that.
So
that's awesome.
To me, that brings up an interesting question, right? So if we're before, to the left side of this boundary of alignment that's on the screen, where you're making that transition between the planning and the designing, or you're in that designing phase. Is it not what you just described, communication and collaboration, more than formal documentation of change, right?
Yeah.
But what impact does that have from anyone who has a legal perspective on it from here? What's the balance with, we need to document exactly what happened, because you talked earlier about not putting in a design fault as a reason, right? Everybody wants to stay away from that, but we can't get so vague. So what do you see as striking a balance there? And I open that to anybody's thought.
Well, I'll say that, you know, quote, legally, when a professional engineer puts a seal on that drawing and they take it across that boundary of certification, and it is issued for construction document. Now there's a stake driven in the sand. And so somebody has to deal with what's on that document. And by the way, when it goes to the build phase, I guess it's boundary of realization. Sorry. When it goes into the build phase, I haven't done this in a while, but I typically will sit the contractor down and it's kind of like, look me in the eye. You are not authorized to deviate from the design at all. Mm-hmm. And so all you can do is ask a question. And if it's a better idea, you know, you want to do something that's more constructible, I want to hear about it. But if I don't hear from you, you are going to put it in exactly the way that document says. And that's where we kind of, it's like, there's our contract, so to speak. And we kind of go from there.
Well, and Randy, I think that was a discussion we were having in the pre-call, was that's what separates phase one plan from phase two design, is that phase one plan, Duke knows their requirements. They know what it needs to be, but that constructability discussion, that structural engineer back and forth, that's what phase two is meant for, so that you don't have to have any RFIs past the boundary realization in that build phase. Yeah. But do we actually know the requirements at boundary alignment? As a contractor, I can say that there are a lot of owners that think they know, but then they don't. That's another kind of an RFI, right?
And Randy,
and you know, the gentleman that was asking earlier about bringing lessons back from old RFIs, and Tammy was answering that question. So I mentioned something called our design criteria, and boy, that's an important document for us, because in my mind, lessons learned are good and you can read them in that moment that you read it, you got it in your head. But 3 years later, when the project's knee deep in it, you can easily forget that, or maybe 2 or 3 projects away, you can clearly forget that. And so what we do is memorialize those tidbits of information in the design criteria.
Oh yeah.
So somebody may read it and say, well, this is crazy. Why do you do it like this? Well, we've come to learn that this is the way we do it at Duke, and it solves a bunch of other problems.
Yeah,
Randy,
we did the same.
You also mentioned that as you pass through that boundary realization, you start getting into the build, how it's not a straight golden thread at all, that it's a continuous improvement cycle that actually pulls back to potentially that design criteria. We've been using now for the past 2 or 3 years now this thing called an asset brief, which is actually before pre-planning, in order to get things budgeted, right? And then going to all the way over to the boundary of certification and to operate. I really like how this is broken out, especially with the DFMA piece in here, because the modularization, the offsite construction is becoming more and more and more prominent, that you can almost take this very flat 2D graph, and I'd almost want it to be 3-dimensional, because it's like a Rubik's Cube.
Yeah.
In order to find what we call heterarchy, where depending on where your roles and responsibilities are, you can always go back to in your case, your design criteria, our asset brief, and understand the decisions that have been made and how they connect literally by creating that Rubik's Cube way of
moving it,
pushing, move, and it's not just the data, it's the decision making. But this is where contracts come in, and you're dead right, Randy. It's like, once you hit that contract, that's a legal document. To change that thing is really the magic. Either the project's going to be successful or not. But I really like that idea about, you just don't stop the boundary realization. And in certain cases, you have to make sure that the boundaries have flexibility.
Yeah.
I'm gonna hijack the screen for a second here and share something because you brought it up, Paul. Because you're right, like I would love it for it to be 3D, but even just having like the grid system, right? Of like, there's almost different responsibilities for these tiers of data between the accommodated environment, everything that everybody should be accessing at the bottom, your drawings, your specs, your whatever, versus your tier one is kind of that first question, that first issue, or that status report, or that whatever, versus the spear and gap, or kind of that liability of the designer crosses over to tier two, so that any formal RFI response, formal design issuance falls into tier two, and then any cost or schedule impact or budgeting that comes off of that is tier three. And then anything that's ultimately an owner's requirement or an owner's decision falls into four. And so you've got your phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and you've got your tier 0 through tier 4. And man, if we could just get the industry to understand that, how much more productive of conversations would we be having about all this nuance and complexity? Because like, this is an RFI process, just an electrical contractor to GC and a little bit of the design, but we don't even touch really what's happening in the design world, because it was more electrical contractor perspective heavy. But there's a lot more that needs to be built out with those perspectives for sure.
This screams to be like a solar system type of three-dimensional graph, because
constellation, yeah, or neural network, or exactly, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're building.
That's right. That's right.
Very cool. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. There we go.
but even that as a hierarchy, it's not a hierarchy, but the whole idea of having those layers and understand where your role of that decision and how those dominoes fall is huge, which is why, just getting back to what, Tammy was doing over at Skanska, I think is something that we just don't budget for enough in our industry, or we just don't care.
And that's McLeamy's curve, right? I mean, that's been around for how long? Well, I mean, it actually it was Boyd C. Paulson's curve before that in the 70s. But we and that's psychology, right? Like, we know what we should do.
We know what we should do.
Human nature, like, we continue to do the same things over and over again.
Yep.
Well, but usually it's like, don't call my baby ugly. Don't call me ugly.
So I'm going to ask a question. Anil, you introduced us to the golden thread earlier last year. And it really helped us tie all these things together. And now Paul brings up a great perspective on 4D chess from the Big Bang Theory that we have to create now. You're the data guy. You're the standards guy here. Could
we take it from the golden thread to the quantum thread?
How do we put something behind that? And Jeff, I can see you thinking about it too. So formulate that idea.
Well, I think both Tammy and Randy, if you think about how they started discussing, the point was data. I think it's all about data. You can have many software. And one thing I have come to realize after working in several countries, that you can't change the number of software tools that I call it the project delivery network is going to use. You can't say everyone just use Microsoft Word. That is going to not happen. Yeah. So we will still be using multiple tools. Whichever one I like to use a particular estimating tool, no problem. How can we accomplish that? I think it's through that data integration. And that data then needs to travel through the life of the project. So that's why we call it the golden thread. And the term golden thread was born out of really a very bad situation. The Grenfell fires has led in the UK to come up with this idea that all buildings should have a golden thread of data. If some component, a bulb was changed by somebody during the design process, it needs to have a blockchain or some kind of a fingerprint, why and how that change was made, especially when people's life is involved or safety is involved. So I think that's why we're so passionate about data standards. Currently, we work as RICS on cost data, which I think is important to have even in a digital twin. If you can somehow combine your cost workflows with design workflows through a common cost data classification system, that'll be useful. But one thing I wanted to really point out today after having this discussion, and I think Paul, Tammy, and Randy have made really excellent points. I was just reading through, I eventually printed the recent definition released by the Digital Twin Consortium of a digital twin. Very interestingly, they say that a digital twin is about entities and process. They didn't just say about a physical thing or an asset. So it has components, systems, buildings, multiple buildings. In the UK, you have the National Digital Twin, but they also add the word process, meaning the RFIs, the constructability analysis, all other things that we talked about are also relevant. It's not just about a BIM model and a physical asset connected bidirectionally. It's also about the processes that are taking place in between them, because you got to make sure that the two are synchronized.
Yeah.
So I think that's why this discussion is very relevant, because data and processes need to sit very clearly in this discussion of digital twins. When we are talking about, you have various phases, you have various players, and I talk even multiple projects, because I've worked on projects where I have made the same mistake on the same project and on the next project, and then learned that there is a very simple, I know somebody from Lean is here, there's a poker yoke technique where you can mistake proof. You can actually have widgets. So we came up with some little widgets, inexpensive ones, that'll make sure you don't make that same mistake on your next step or on your next project. So I think this process and data is very relevant. It may not seem relevant when we talk about digital twins, but I think it is, because that's where wisdom lies. And I think we're talking about 90% of the data currently, and I think Tammy, you said we're sitting on loads and loads of data. I think my estimate is 90% of that data is not being used.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We don't use it.
Convert that into wisdom on our next project, put it into an asset brief. That wisdom will help improve every project and asset that we make.
I wish I'd done that with my wives.
No comment.
No comment.
so Anil, one of the things that, and thank you for sharing that about now that process is embedded into these things. One of the things that we're not struggling with, we're challenged with right now with developing a metaverse with different types of folks that are, it goes beyond the physical assets that are static data. And we're now dealing with mobility, transportation, and human beings walking around with apps that are now flowing through as a dynamic piece of data through our built environments that don't change so much. So that definition of digital twin now is being challenged. That is, it's not about just the build aspect and then the delivery of our assets, but what happens when we reimagine what that asset is in a life cycle approach of its measures of, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? And with EPC, Randy, like I know the measures are off the charts, especially, about how the flows are happening, how certain milestones have to be kept. And then how do you put a future state into there so that you're designing not just for now and not just for 10 years, but in a continuous improvement cycle by using the digital twin to be that brain and be what Joe Pine is calling the genius platform, where the digital twin, as it's moving forward, as it learns, can report back to you about best outcomes, right? And this is where computational design, all the other stuff has a piece of all this. But what I'm finding fascinating is when you take the different systems of, like, let's say a city, education, healthcare, transportation, all these things, and how the built environment becomes that linchpin, that if we get the digital twin right, there's going to be a lot of other systems that can interface with that and then start to become the system of systems. And, so that's where our approach is from a future state. But now we got to get back to brass tacks. Like, yeah, but what do I do tomorrow morning?
Yeah. And I also think, Paul, I think our challenge there is that we are still a people and paper industry, right? I mean, when we talk about digital twin and we have these conversations, it is reliant on the fact that we can move data between systems. And this is data driven. This is a data driven world, right? We need the data. We are sitting on data in these, literally in notebooks, on desks and in your cars. And the industry is still paper and people driven. And we have to find a way, whether that be you use your favorite, Anil said it best, you use your favorite estimating tool, right? I shouldn't care what tool you're using a great tool. There's data in that tool. Now I need to get that data from your tool to Randy's tool so that Randy can see that data. And then I need to move it from Randy's tool to Jeff's tool and then to Kelly's tool. The environment has to be interconnected and has to be a multi-layered universe, because the people and the processes are always going to be part of construction in the industry that we live in, right? We're never going to 100% replace people and processes. The processes have to follow certain rules in order to achieve the data environment that we need. So there's this continuing factor of people and process and the data, and we're all the data is siloed into as many tiles as I have on my screen right now. That shouldn't matter. Let's go get the data from wherever it is. That's my passion, right? I want the data. I want to use the data, and I don't care what Kelly and Paul and Greg are all using. I want to be able to bring it into one location and share it. So then we can report on it. Then we can do whatever the heck we want to with it, right? But we have to find a way to let you continue to use your favorite product, Anil, and let's share that data, because the data is the gold mine. The data is the gold mine. And it's just going back to the safety conversation. Safety data should be shared, because you're not the only contractor who made that mistake. Somebody else made that mistake. And if we can't share that with somebody else, that safety impact, then we're not protecting our entire industry. And the goal is to protect the industry, right? So yeah, I'll get off my soapbox, but
before we jump too far off that soapbox, let me challenge you. Safety, I think, stands on its own, like environmental and things like that, to where we owe it to the public, to our community, to our fellow workers, to fellow men and women that we work with, to keep each other safe.
100%.
So it's sort of like we've got a common ground there. There should be nothing that interferes with keeping up with the data associated with observations, whatever it is, to make us safer every year.
I agree with you. Yep.
Once we talk estimating and I'm thinking quantities, unit costs for installation, that kind of stuff. Now you're talking money, and you're talking in a capitalist economy. There are companies, Skanska, I know Black & Veatch. When I was there, I knew to the penny what it would cost to build a 7FA combustion turbine simple cycle on a typical site.
That's right.
I was not going to share that with Florida Power and Light or Duke. Yeah. I mean, if they ask me for a quote, I'll give them a quote. And I know
it's still a competitive world, right, Randy?
Absolutely. And so some ways there's certain data. Now the quantities from Duke perspective, guess what? I'm pulling those quantities out of those contractors because I don't see that as proprietary. And so far I've been successful, and I can get those quantities out of them. Mm-hmm. And then I can come up with my own unit install rates and that kind of stuff. So, but we're really more interested in time and, how much labor, how many people do we have to have on site? We stack on top, so the data is useful to us. And so I guess that's a long-winded answer of saying, yeah, there's a whole lot of pads out there with a whole lot of information on it, different software, that kind of thing. But what we want is data that is useful for different purposes for us.
Yeah. And that's a whole nother conversation, right? Useful data. That's useful versus just irrelevant.
So I kind of want to chime in here a sec. I sort of agree with Tammy, but I also disagree. And here's where it is. I agree that there are a lot of these silos. The problem is that they're all willfully created to fail. I mean, the thing is that the way computer science and computer engineering works today, the construction industry, the entire built asset industry, from buildings through infrastructure and everything, has conspired against itself to disable the ability to share data that's there, that every other industry seems to be able to share with no problem.
Right.
And this points back to you know, a people problem and a business model problem, and, you know, all of these kinds of things, is trying to figure out, you know, where the value is. And, you know, with respect to Randy, I think there is a lot of legitimate questions to say, well, where is the actual value of something? You know, we can say when it comes to like building a building, the hard cost, the cost of material, along with the quantities, should be known. And granted, depending on who your source is for your materials, that cost will be different.
Yeah.
Right.
But 15 different contractors could approach the same supplier and they should get the same number.
But they're probably not going to.
Well, so that's to me, that's a problem, right?
Yep.
That's not, you know, you don't just let it slide. You have to address that as a problem.
Yeah.
And because there's many other industries, they wouldn't get a different number. They would just say, okay, we know what the hard costs are. And then, you know, when it comes to like time and labor, then those are the things that vary and, you know, can present that type of variance in one contractor's cost versus another. And then there's also this idea of, well, you know, quality and warranty and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I wanted to get into what Anil was talking to as well, is to me, there are these two different data sets. There's the digital twin as the physical asset and all of these processes of how it operates over time, the future state and all that, as Paul pointed out too. But at the same time, then there's all of this business data, which you were talking about, all this process data and stuff. And I keep asking myself, well, how many people actually treat that business and process data the same way we want to treat this BIM and digital twin data? In a sense, how many people actually map out, use business process notation mapping to actually map out their processes? Like, how do I do this? How do I do my job? How do I do my job on every job? And then look at that and then, you know, do what software does. I mean, day in, day out, what software people do, software engineers do, is when there's a problem, they log a bug, or when somebody finds a problem, they log a bug.
Yep.
And then that bug has to go through the system and somebody has to fix the bug. And the bug either relates to documentation or to the software itself and something in there. And it says, okay, how are we going to fix this bug? And I think it would be an interesting lesson for businesses to learn, is to say, well, how do we bug track? How do we, you know, fix our process in that same way and say, okay, something broke down in this project, right? Like Anil pointed out, something broke down in a project and you started to make the same mistake on the next project.
Mm-hmm.
How do you prevent that from happening? I think, you know, if we mapped out, if we did that actual, you know, process of mapping out those business processes and could see them. And then as you go through a project and say, oh, well, this applies or it doesn't apply, or, oh, by the way, we had a mistake here last time, you know, there's 10 different things logged against why, you know, something went wrong on these projects. Then eventually you'd figure out that you have to fix the process and where to fix it. And not so much, you know, saying, oh, well, the problem is a data problem, or the problem was a, you know, communication problem or whatever. It's like, well, what was it? And then, you know, that's what I think with this RFI data and some of these other things is, yeah, it would be really great to be able to capture that and, you know, look at it in a data lake and look at it across multiple projects and multiple businesses, contractors, owners, and everything, and be able to find those threads. And it can be done. It's just that nobody wants to do it because of this whole idea, well, why should I share my data? Is there a liability for sharing my data? You know, and my response to that is, you know, we can anonymize this in ways that make it useful, but just get off your goddamn high horses and share the damn data. Like, stop it already. All right. Yeah. This is an antiquated mentality that has gotten us nowhere for 120 years and will never get us anywhere until we just say, okay, we can trust that this will be anonymized, but we have to leverage it. Because if we don't, you know, nothing gets better.
Yeah. Jeff, I have to agree with you on the processes situation. I mean, we, as an integrator, as a systems integrator, we talk about manual processes versus automated processes. Literally, I have those conversations 15 times a day. And I think what's really hard in the industry is for a person to actually talk about an entire process from start to finish. I'll give you a real quick, easy example. How many steps does it take to approve an invoice in our world? I can tell you somebody goes to the PO box, they check the box. You know, they don't think about somebody actually opens that mail, actually puts it on a desk. Then how long does it sit there? Let's see. Oh, it's been there 15 days. Oh my gosh, we got to get this vendor paid. Now we got to get it to the project manager to approve. I mean, I literally talk about this as a simple as an invoice, right? And I have to take them from start to finish of what do you do in a day to process an invoice? And this is literally processing an invoice. We haven't even gotten to the complicated stuff of building a project yet, right? But talking about processes and the people that are involved and the sharing of information, we can anonymize this stuff, right? We can build in the question I have that I thought was really interesting, because we are a SaaS-based solution and we issue bugs. My question with that is, you know, coming especially from a giant CM, how do you share that information in that little world, right? Amongst every project team that you have, and we were talking about a company, you know, large companies, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people that are building projects. So I think it's a great, like you put this like things going on in my head, it's bouncing around in there like crazy right now, but now how do you take that and boil it down and share it in a shareable format where literally thousands of people can see it? Anyway, just throwing that out there.
And you know, we did that with bug systems at Vectorworks. We went through 2 or 3 over my career there, and really in the latter 3-4 years, we had people that were much more savvy on being able to take all of that bug information, all those reports, and then really turn them into things that people use. So instead of it being a list of saying, oh, there's 400 bugs logged against this one particular feature, they could look at the entire system and say, oh, well, you know, actually these 3 features are connected. And, you know, we can acknowledge that, you know, there's one person who keeps finding all these damn bugs. Well, why is that?
Why is it?
And then really dig into those things and begin to really truly do proper data mining and then presentation of the data.
To me, that's the cool stuff. Like,
but it's capturing it in the first place,
but it's getting
standardizing that capture, and then just saying, okay, you know, do something with it. And you know, I think AGC and other organizations are a perfect example of, you could say there's a service then an organization like that could provide, right? It's collecting all that data in an anonymized way and then begin to do useful things with it.
So we have sub 30 seconds left here. So I want to grab control while I can, and thank Tammy and Randy for their input today, and really the input from the rest of the group. I think it was a great discussion. But I think what's particularly important to notice is that Randy volunteered to let us see under the hood, so we can
have a little fun too, and relaxation. And so, I mean, to me, that's sort of what I would think of as, I mean, no one's ever asked me that question. I think it's a really good question, actually. I'm going to think more about that long after this is over.
All right, now we need to know who asked the question and what the question was. Now that we got, what about 53 people in here?
Oh, gosh.
And the question was, why did Autodesk spend $1 billion on Innovize today?
That was the question. He's got it in one. Right? That was exactly what. And if you listen to her answer, she answered it correctly.
Because I just renewed my software.
Oh man, so many comments.
They can.
I didn't think Autodesk would outdo themselves with PlanGrid, but geez, hold my beer.
Yeah.